Hey everyone, it is Wednesday. That means it is time for our lovely Anna Kelly to come back to the show as part of our expert series. How you doing today, Anna?
I'm doing great today, Michael. How about you?
Oh, I'm doing wonderful. Always enjoyed speaking with you. Your interviews are very frequently the highest viewed ones of the week, so you have a following on my channel.
Oh,
So
that's
thank you.
awesome.
Yeah. So we have two topics
Thank
today,
you.
and we will go through. We'll do, I guess, in the order that we discussed before we hit record. First is kind of what I'll just put under the umbrella of, hey, the government is here to help, and you and I should be very frightened because that's kind of the one of the quotes I saw one time is anytime the government is here to help, it means we should get really, really nervous. So why don't we talk about that first? And then just so everybody knows what is in the second half, we have now some surveys from reputable real estate firms and organizations talking about how are the big money getting ready to take advantage of this interesting time. So that will be our second topic. But why don't we talk about this thing that AOC is talking about, potentially forgiving rent for up to a year? Did you see that?
I did. And part of me was shocked, and the other part of me thought, here we go with the leftist socialist ideals that really could impact our country that I never really thought could happen. And so not unlike the shock and awe that I think many of us had when we saw that suddenly, people could be forced to not be able to go to work, and then landlords could be forced to not be able to evict people, regardless of if they pay rent, even though they got stimulus money. Now we're seeing, proposed legislation by AOC to basically say, landlords are going to have to completely forgive rent for a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
And if we want help or liquidity, then we've got to make a promise for 5 years, not to raise rents and, multiple other covenants. And it's quite shocking to think that there's actually proposed legislation in that vein at this time.
Yeah, there's not many times that I read an article from quoting this individual. I don't even want to give her airplay. I mean, I hope she gets voted out. She's a communist. Um,
Absolutely.
I read that and I actually said, no, she didn't. This is fake news. This is somebody on the right trying to make her look bad. I mean, it was that out there. I'm like, come on.
Right.
She is an American, right? I mean, come on. This is not normal. But yeah, I went and looked and went to several different trusted resources, and her and 4 or 5 of her close friends, all in the House, I believe, are putting out this are putting it out there. And again, I don't think it goes anywhere. I think it goes against our Constitution, and I'm sure they don't have the power to change our Constitution. Fingers crossed. But I I am frightened by the just sheer size and frequency of these communist and socialist things being proposed. It is frightening on every level that I can think of. That
Yeah,
is
I,
going to
I
happen.
agree, Michael. And I think we just, the question is, what do we do with it as
Hmm.
investors? And I think you can let your mind go all kinds of places. And, if something like that happens, we're all toast,
Yeah.
at least to some extent.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to navigate freedom and capitalism at all when
Yeah.
you're governed by socialistic policies, communistic policies. But barring that kind of thing happen, I do see that government is getting more and more involved in the private business of rental real estate. So we already were seeing states like New York and California coming in with rent controls.
Hmm.
For right or for wrong, it makes it very, very difficult if you've been an investor, you have properties, you're buying with the value add, thinking I'm going to be able to raise rents to where they are, and suddenly a government can come in and tell you, oh, wait, stop, you can't raise rents anymore. And so we're already seeing that actually start to happen. And I think what it means for investors is we've got to be prepared that we've got to be able to mitigate even more risks and underwrite even more conservatively, knowing that now we have this legislative risk to think about that most of us never really had to think too much about. We dealt with market risk.
Hmm.
We dealt with local market and economic risk, market cycles, recessions,
Yeah.
layoffs, all of those things that you can kind of mitigate to say, where do I invest for the best chance of long-term success?
Yeah.
Now we've got to add to that legislative risk and potential rent controls. So
Yeah.
for me, it says, number one, at a state level, I'm going to continue to invest in the most conservative political areas, because those local leaders and statewide leaders are less likely to impose things like rent controls and limits on evictions than maybe California. But I think, we have to now keep that in mind and take that to heart when we're deciding whether we buy property, and maybe get more conservative with our, vacancy numbers, our economic vacancy numbers, what our rents are, and how much debt we put on those properties in case the government comes in and says, surprise, nobody has to pay you and you still have to pay your bills. Yeah. So it's a very real risk that we're dealing with now. And the thought that more of that could come, it is frightening. And I think we have to be realistic that those kind of things may come, hopefully not to that extreme, and then just be really careful with what we buy.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things, and I'm so happy that we kind of see the same things and our experiences go that way. So the first thing, so obviously, I invest in California. We had a bill on our ballot, I want to say 2 Novembers ago, that the California population voted against. Something like 68% voted no and 30% yes. So it didn't pass. But our lovely, socialist leader, Gavin Newsom, decided to just publish an assembly bill and pass rent control without our consent. So again, wow. we said no, he said yes, he's the governor, he won. So it can still happen. So yeah, California is under rent control. I want to say the last 6 months, but in this pandemic we're in, you often forget what happened before. But yeah, we are definitely in rent control now. But when I look at all this wave of, I'll call it socialist kind of live for free, don't pay rent, trust the government nonsense. What I see as the outcome is, I believe what started as a Depression era program, I'll just genericize it as Section 8 Housing Authority. I believe we are going to see a super turbocharged housing assistance or housing program that could be managed by, quote unquote, the government. So what I mean by that is actually, if you read the bill that AOC pointed out, I don't think there's any chance in hell, at least in the current environment, people get free rent. You're allowed to change contracts. You can't change the Constitution. But the second part of that bill or proposed bill was the government will be a buyer of essentially affordable housing. And I'm like, ooh, that could happen, right? They could come in just like eminent domain, or maybe they come in and pay, list price, or maybe even 10% above list. And maybe the government becomes the owner of housing stock. I mean, that could happen. I hope it doesn't, but it could happen. I mean, is that something you've even thought about?
I have. I read an article, I don't remember where this week, that was talking about government leaders already talking about, housing being the next human right. So just like healthcare is a human right, now housing is a human right. And so if you frame it in that perspective, then they can say, because the big bad landlords, just like the big bad health insurance companies or drug companies or whatever, are making it too expensive for people to live, we're going to come in and make sure that these big bad landlords don't charge too much for your rent. Mm-hmm. And so even though they might come in and buy a bunch of real estate, I think they will also come in and start to regulate a bunch of real estate in the name of housing is a human right and nobody should be able to make too much money off of you. So there are definitely leaders who are talking about that already. And I think that we have to see that may be coming, that maybe there's a nationalized rent control of some sort that follows once they start down this path of, getting into the business of regulating real estate or owning real estate in some way.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because because again, I go back to the fact that I think just like the Depression born the housing assistance program, I believe this pandemic, when we look back on it in 5 or 6 years, it will born something around affordable housing. The question becomes to me is, okay, does it branch to legislation, i.e. rent control, minimum, maximums, blah, 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 right? Which is probably easier. Or does government, like maybe at the state level or even the county level, become an owner of affordable housing. And that frightens me to death if they
Yeah,
become
I think both.
owners.
I think we're going to see both to
Wow.
some extent. The question is how far reaching and how far in the future before we're really impacted as independent investors.
Yeah, because then you play the ownership side. And again, I'm doing this in real time, so this may make no sense. So if they become owners and we still have the Constitution in a free economy, which I guess could be an assumption at this point, yeah, they're going to come in and buy stuff. Now, do they just buy stuff that we list? Do they use eminent domain and other legal tactics to just take property? Actually, even eminent domain, you can't take property. You have to compensate the owner for it. But I mean, do they just select whole neighborhoods and go, hey? But again, this does not end well. It doesn't end well for the tenants. It doesn't end well for the. I mean, just look at rent control. You can look at New York and San Francisco and look at what rent control has done. It may feel good today, but it doesn't feel good in 10 years. This does not end well. But again, as investors, our job is to look at this and go, okay, if that's the chessboard, how do I dance through the raindrops? And that's a frightening thing to think about.
Yeah, one thing that I think about when I look at these kind of things is what is realistically going to be agreed upon between two opposing parties that are very far, extreme one another in terms of what their, typical economic policy is. One thing we have seen in this crisis is a general coming together of both parties, even though there's still some fighting in there. They're coming together with some common sense agreed to, legislation. Some of it may be not common sense to me, but they've agreed to something, to get us through a crisis. And so I think what are both parties in both the House and the Senate likely to pass if they want to come to some kind of agreement that we need to have more affordable housing? And I think that what they're probably going to do or what they might agree to is say, listen, let's target those areas where the demographics are below average income. Mm. So poverty level and just above poverty level, but below the median income. I think those housing complexes, C minus, really more C minus and D types of properties are probably the first ones that the government buys, just like they do HUD housing today in some ways, and that they really focus on those because those are the ones who their rent as a percentage of their income is extremely high. Yeah. And there really is an affordability problem in this country in many areas. And so I think they're more likely to at least start there. Hopefully they stop there. But I think if you're renting to people who are, above median income, high income earners, class A and B apartment space, I don't think the government's going to come in there and demand that you have rent controls because they're not concerned about the middle class and the wealthy. They don't care to help them. They say you're on your own. So if they want to pay more for housing, I think they'll be able to do it. So as an investor, this extreme socialist bill and AOC is a little extreme and won't. But what could happen, maybe I shift my focus if I'm buying in those, class C minus D low income areas to say, I'm either only going to buy Section 8 housing and chalk it up to I'm going to be a low profit business, but steady income, or I'm going to completely shift away from C and only buy Class A and B properties. And there's other issues with that you've got to mitigate too. But I'm already in the Class B market space. Primarily everything I buy is, I would say, is a Class B area, even though it might be an older building. And I think buying smaller complexes where they're less likely to come in and say, I'm going to take your 4-unit and your duplex and your single. Yeah. I think they're more likely to say anyone that has an apartment complex and community, these are the rules if you own more than X number of units. I think that's more likely to happen in those kind of areas. So something we need to think about.
Yeah, again, my portfolio is probably more Class C stuff, right? Affordable housing. I have a bunch of Section 8. I think 35% of the income comes from that. So yeah, I have to watch this. It is going to be interesting. So, okay, so let's go to part 2. Right, it's been a month in this. We're already in, I think, our 7th week here in Santa Clara County. It's starting to get mind numbing and Groundhog Day ish. But what are the real estate pundits, the people out there that are survived and thrived during the last crash like us? What are they what are they kind of, when you're reading about what they're looking at, any kind of trends kind of morph from what you're seeing?
Sure. I've read several different surveys that have been done. Some just kind of small, but by real estate attorneys and SEC attorneys who have a lot of clients in the multifamily space, and also from some national publications, just asking apartment owners in general what their feel is, what their consumer sentiment is right now in terms of whether values are going to come down and how much, and whether they're buying or not, and how much or how long they might wait. And I was pretty surprised that more than 70% of rental property owners believed that housing values were going to come down between 10 and 30% in the next 6 months. And so it's a huge percentage of those owners now that say, we think this is big, and we think, and I'm sure with multifamily, for example, if you have 3 months of bad collections, your values can come down a lot. Yeah. So, when you're buying stuff at 6 to 7 cap prices, 5 to 10% dip in occupancy and net collections decreases your value of that property 20%. So it doesn't take much of a dip in occupancy to have commercial values come down because they're a function of the net operating income. And so that part doesn't surprise me. I was surprised that though the large percentage of those that thought it would come down that much, and over half thought it would come down more, values would come down more than 20% across real estate in the next 6 months to a year. And because of that, the majority are staying on the sidelines. It's just about 55% that I believe across all these different articles that I read that are saying we are not buying right now. We believe that prices are going to come down. We're holding cash, and we'll see what happens in the next 6 months to a year before we even think about buying something else. So there's definitely a hold on buying by most. And I think about a quarter, 20% to 25% said they were still actively looking for deals and buying. But most people are kind of on the sidelines and somewhat pessimistic as to what property values are going to do over the next 6 months to a year.
Well, all I got to say is I'm glad I sold my apartments in 2019. That's my first thought after hearing that. Oh my goodness gracious. Yeah. And you definitely, single family is kind of the same thing. I saw a pretty scary metric today for jumbo loans, right? Jumbo loans, traditionally 510 and above, in high price markets, 719, I think. But 5.5% of jumbo loans, which again aren't sold to the government, right? They're held on portfolios, are already in forbearance. 5.5%.
And even Fannie and Freddie loans, I saw a little over 5% so far as well. So I'm surprised at how many property owners of multifamily have already asked for a forbearance. To have it granted, you actually have to be in a pretty poor cash position to not be able to make your rental payments. So we kind of talked before, those big value add investors who are still paying top dollar and hoping to push the rents even higher, they are running out of cash and they are in a desperate situation. So, the forbearance hopefully will help them. But if rents continue to struggle, if this COVID lasts longer, I saw the CDC, one of the representatives come out yesterday and say, we could have an even worse wave in the winter.
Yeah, can he stop that, please? I saw that too. I'm like, what the hell are you doing, you freaking guy?
Fear-monger.
God,
it's fear-mongering. But, it shakes sentiment. And so if people are afraid that they might lose their jobs through the end of the year and stop paying rents, it really can hurt even conservative investors like ourselves. But those who really, overpaid or in that value add, they're going to struggle. So it's going to be an opportunity to buy properties in the future. But I think the credit requirements and the underwriting requirements to even be able to purchase these types of assets going forward, especially commercial, are going to be much, much tighter because they're just going to want to see a lot more liquidity, a lot more reserves. And I think higher vacancy numbers in your underwriting for the future, because this is just one pandemic. What the CDC says was there's already 30 mutations of coronavirus. So what's the next one? What's the government going to do when it happens again? Is this going to be an ongoing, the government takes the opportunity to just make more and more legislation for the next time? Or is this really done in 3 months and we go back to some semblance of normal with temporary dips in pricing and temporary constraints on lending.
Yeah. So I just wanted to paint the vision of how this kind of unfolds in my experience. So I bought 3 apartment buildings in the last crash for essentially 0 down, which sounds great, but realize this is how it all unfolded and why timelines are important, right? So I bought an 18-unit building for 700 grand, and I bought 2 10-unit buildings side by side, so really 20 units for 440, right? 220 each building, right? So crazy numbers when you look at it price per door. But here's the deal, right? So first off, the 700K 18-unit building, that building sold in 2004 for 1.44 million.
Wow.
It had government debt. It's Fannie or Freddie or someone. And then the owner had a second on it for like 200 grand, something like that. That building did okay for the first couple of years. 2007 happened. C-class apartments didn't do well in a recession. That owner tried to limp through for the better part of 30 months before it was foreclosed on. And it actually was foreclosed on by the second. So the second took over and bought it back for whatever. That building had 30 months of delayed repairs, maintenance. It was probably the worst apartments I had ever seen. We end up buying it in, so what would that be? 04 or 07? We probably bought it in 2010 from the original owner who foreclosed as the second for 700 grand and 0 down. But we had to spend, almost $200,000 because the person who was limping through in today's world of forbearance, right? Forbearance wasn't a topic in 06, 08 at all. But that's what's going to happen. These C-class value add folks, they're going to start cutting corners. They're going to start doing lipstick on a pig. They're going to start not repairing things that should be repaired. And assets on the other side of this are going to be wrecked. Same thing with the 20 units. One of the buildings, some out-of-state investor tried to fix it from afar. We ended up buying it vacant. And half of the building was 5 and 5, was essentially gutted. So that's what's going to happen to these owners, that these value add players, is they're going to start projects. They're going to half fix them. You're going to have to double check the work because who knows what they did. They could have I saw one of the units, sheetrock was put up, but the plumbing wasn't attached. I mean, God, this is going to be bad.
And I think the key is, so, in full disclosure, I have 250 units right now that were a value add deal. That we're working through the same issues that everybody else is. So, what we're doing, and I think is the right thing to do, is we're holding off on capital improvements at this point. So yes, our main vision was let's, update all these units, raise the values, eventually you sell, you cash out. Well, now, we've made a significant dent in the number of units that we've renovated, but anything else right now that comes vacant, we're touching it up. Mm-hmm. These properties are 10, 15 years old, so they're already pretty nice properties, but we're touching it up. We're focusing on lease up. We're focusing on retention, and we're not going through our CapEx. So, worst case situation, we end up asking for a forbearance, and we use some of the cash, we had a lot of cash, thankfully, because we just started this deal. We have to use some of that cash to cover debt payments if things got really bad for a while. So we're thankfully not in a position where we've got to cut corners and say, well, we're not going to repair things. We're going to continue to maintain the property, but we certainly are not in a position to, aggressively spend a lot of money and hope that you can raise rents when nobody can even get out to look at an apartment today. Yeah. And most people don't want to look out at an expensive apartment when they don't know if they're going to have a job. And so it's definitely requiring a shift. I think for any owners, whether you're an income-based owner and you don't have a lot of CapEx, but you rely on no more than 10% vacant, if you have a vacancy debt, even your non-value add owners are going to struggle to be able to pay their expenses, and you are going to have some deferred maintenance. So I think the lesson in all of this for all of us investors, regardless of what asset class, is no longer highly leveraging short-term bridge loans. You've got to really be able to leverage at a point that you could afford a 20, 25% dip and that still break even. I think you should be more conservative than that. But having enough reserves and liquidity well above what the lender requires is really important.
Yeah.
And in 2009, I was always like, why should I have to keep 6 months liquid for all my expenses? I don't want to. That's way too much. I can be using that powder to buy more and expand. I'm glad I did that, but I was in a recovery phase where I knew values were going to go up.
Right.
Now, if you don't have 6 months expenses saved and something like this happens again, you're toast.
Yeah.
So I think people become more conservative and less aggressive on their value adds, and definitely more conservative in underwriting, and you've got to hold cash at all times. You just got to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. The where I was going with my example is I think you're right. These people are not buying and they're keeping their powder dry because, again, same thing with houses, but really in multifamily, you can limp along for quarters and quarters and quarters before a bank will actually want to foreclose. They don't want your asset. They will bend over backwards, especially in an environment with falling prices or falling values. They don't want it. So it could be years before a bank takes something back. And it's those decisions that happened 2 quarters ago that will affect the next buyer because, hey, we just didn't turn that unit. We already had too many vacancies. We didn't want it. It's the stuff you're going to buy on the other side of this is farther away than investors think. And it will be worse. It'll be in worse condition than you're planning for. That's my takeaway.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. And I have so many people talking about, oh, I can't get, people are blowing up my comment section. I'm getting so excited. You've been talking about this for years. It's coming. I'm like, oh my God, it won't happen until 2021 at the earliest.
Yeah, those people that are like, I can't wait to buy a deal in the next 3 to 6 months. If they've got tons and tons of cash and they can really find a really great deal, 30, 40% below what today's values are, and get in there creatively, maybe if they're very experienced. But I think if you haven't already gone through a downturn and come out on the other side of it, and you don't already have a lot of cash and a lot of experience, I think you've got to wait 6, 9 months, a year before we really start seeing deals priced well enough that they're worth taking the risk on buying today.
I got to tell you, people think I'm a broken record. The only thing a new investor needs to be doing today is learning their market. You need to learn your market. You need to look at your market every day for the next 90 days. Markets have heartbeats, especially at inflection points. And if you can spend the time learning your market, you will start to see what Anna and I see, right? We know our markets that well. And it's tomorrow's price is not yesterday's price. Sellers want to remember yesterday. We're investors. We want to talk about tomorrow, and prices are sticky. And it's just interesting.
Read the news articles, read what's happening in the mortgage markets, read what's happening in the rental markets, and align yourself with other solid investors who have experience. Maybe do market research for them, do something to make yourself valuable so that when things do turn and it's the right time, you've developed some relationship with some people that can give you some guidance to say, hey, not yet, or don't catch a falling knife. We're not at the bottom yet, so it takes experience and financial acumen, and just time and wisdom to be able to see those things. So you can be the smartest person out of the gate, but if you don't have the experience and really understand cycles and economies and your local market, you can make some big mistakes that can be painful. So, patience is really important right now, and spending the time to learn and align yourself with good people.
Yeah, I don't know if this analogy plays, and if a firefighter listens to this, feel free to correct me. But sometimes firefighters need to stay on the outside, right? Running into the fire, the building that's on fire is not always the right answer. Sometimes, the structure, the roof is gone. You just need to wait for it to fall down. You need to make sure the fire doesn't spread, but you also want to make sure the fire doesn't kill you. Right. So don't be early. That's what I'm telling all these people that are just like vibrating with excitement. Don't be early. Don't be early. Learn your market. I look every day still. I've been doing this 20 years. So
me too. And I'm still opportunistic. I think it's probably like a broken record, but there are deals to be had in every single market cycle. If you're aggressive enough in looking for deals, you can find something. But the question is it a deal that you should do today? And does it align with where you are? And unless you are very well capitalized and still have enough cash that you can risk, this is a time of preservation mode. This is not the time for aggressive accumulation and taking risks and hoping you're going to make several $1,000,000 in a crisis. This is the time to preserve, be wise, be patient. And then when you see values really drop, you'll be ready to capitalize and become a little more opportunistic. But this is a time that every investor, I don't care how wise you are, how much money you have, needs to be careful, because there's just too many things changing that we just can't foresee. And every day something new happens that we go, what? How can this be? And so until there's a little more stability, the government starts laying off some of the regulations, people are back at work, and you see what's going to happen with lending and these forbearances in a year, it's just wise to be patient and wait.
We're going to end it right there. I think that is perfect advice. I want to thank you again, Anna, for being our Wednesday guest. You have a great day. All right.
You too. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, guys.